Today, we're talking about proof that God exists. So stick around for that. Meanwhile, I'm going to get packed up to head outside. I'm going to need an ND filter because it is very bright outside. Extra battery because the battery life on this camera is absolutely horrible. 50mm lens just in case. Tripod for filming by myself. And a granola bar. So I'm going to pack all this up and I will see you outside in just a couple seconds. Alright, you're gonna have to bear with me here. It's an extremely windy day. I don't know if you can tell. Hopefully the mic's doing a pretty good job. I'm just gonna get to the forest so I can start shooting, and then I'll meet you back there. Alright, I've made it to the forest. I'm really hoping it's less windy in here and that this whole video is not ruined because of bad audio. But anyway, chances are if you're watching this video, you've probably questioned once or twice in your life whether or not God exists. Or at least you've wondered whether or not that's even something that's possible. Now for the sake of this video, I just want you to ask yourself, well, what if? What if there is a God that exists? What then? I'm not asking you to believe quite yet. You can wait until you hear some of the arguments put forward. But for the sake of this video, just ask yourself, what if God does exist? The first point we want to touch on for today's video is to answer the question that has been one of the biggest debates for the past many centuries, and that's where everything as we know it came into existence. For instance, where did the world come from? Where did plant and animal life come from? Where did our own ability to think come from? Because it's easy to see all these things on the surface as we do, but when you actually take out a microscope and dig a bit deeper and look closer, you realize that everything we know is incredibly complex. Now there's two main strings of thought that people have followed for the most part when trying to answer this question. On the one hand, people say evolution, that this all came about by chance. And then on the other hand, there's the argument for God, that all this was done by a creative being. Now, I know that both sides could argue this for days and days upon end, and both bring quite a lot of evidence to support their side. But for the point of this video, we just want to examine kind of the logic between both of those arguments. Now, if you've done any research into this topic yourself, you've probably found that there's kind of three main arguments that people turn to when they're trying to argue for the existence of God. Now, the first of those arguments is what's called the cosmological argument, and that argues with the principle of cause and effect. So that means that because the world exists as it now is, well, there must have been a first cause, and that therefore would be God. Now the second argument is what is called the teleological argument, and that argues based on the complexity of life as we see around us. And that basically states that because everything we know has a purpose and is created with a goal, that therefore there must have been someone or a creator who made it with that purpose, and that would be God. And finally, there's what's called the anthropological argument, which argues the existence of God based on man's moral capacity. So because we have the ability to make moral decisions, there must have been a power that instilled those within us, and that would be related to God. So those are kind of the three great arguments that people use to argue God's existence, but for the purpose of this video, we just want to focus on one, being the teleological argument. So come along, I'll show you what I Now, chances are you've probably heard of what's called the watchmaker argument. It's kind of a sub-argument for the teleological idea, but basically the argument goes like this. One day, you're walking through a field and you stub your foot on a stone. If asked how the stone came to be there, you could logically reason that the stone had probably been there forever. But if, while walking through that same field, you stumbled across a watch, and being asked how it came to be there, chances are you wouldn't say that it had always existed. With all of its intricacy and the way each piece worked together for a specific purpose, you would likely suppose that the watch had been carefully designed by a watchmaker. Now, just like a watch, but on a bit more of a grand scale, the Earth is kind of like the watch in that argument. Now, we don't have time to go into all the detail, but for instance, consider the position of the Earth, or all the details in our human body. There's trillions and trillions of cells in our body, and each single one has its own purpose, and is working to help us move and breathe and live, and all these things that we do as humans. And so to say that all of this happened by chance, to me that just seems incredibly absurd. Now that's the argument in simple terms, but to say that that actually proves that the God of the Bible is the one who created all these things, I don't think that necessarily stands. But at the same time, I think we can prove that the God of the Bible is the God who created all of these things, and I'll show you why. One of the biggest proofs we have for the existence of God today is actually the nation of Israel. Now stay with me here. I'm going to explain why I think the Jews are a living witness to the God of the Bible's existence. Now I want you to think for a second of all the most powerful nations that have existed in the world. The Babylonians, they're gone. The Egyptians, they're gone. What about the Roman Empire? Gone. But Israel, who is one of the smallest and the most hated nations in all of the world, still exists, and it lives in its own land. And that's even after the Holocaust and after AD 70, all these events where people tried to wipe them out entirely, and they still live in their land today. And why is that? Well, it's because God said so in his Bible. You know, thousands of years ago, the Bible stated that Israel was going to be taken out of their land for a long period of time, and eventually they would be brought back and established as a nation. Now, for a while that seemed really hard to believe, and in the 1850s, there was a man named John Thomas who read his Bible and believed that it was the truth. And while everyone else thought that the Jews coming back to Israel would be impossible, this man, John Thomas, firmly believed that Israel would be reinstated to their land. And this is what he said in one of his books. There is then a partial and primary restoration of the Jews before the manifestation. Now that's the return of Christ to the earth. The pre-adventual colonization of Palestine will be on purely political principles. They will emigrate thither as agriculturists and traders in the hope of ultimately establishing their commonwealth, but more immediately of getting rich in silver and gold by commerce with India, and in cattle and goods by their industry at home under the efficient protection of the British power. Now that was written 172 years ago, and you'd never guess what happened 99 years later. Israel, under purely political principles backed up by Britain, was reinstated back into their land and established as a world power. This wasn't just some crazy prophecy from a weirdo guy in the 1850s. This was biblical teaching. This was something he discovered from reading his Bible. Now, of course, this is an argument that could go on for many weeks, and I wouldn't say at all that we can cover it to the full extent, but I hope that at least what this video has done has got you thinking a little bit and questioning whether or not God does exist. And you know, I can tell you personally that believing in something greater than yourself, believing that someone else is in control and life isn't all about you, is an incredibly comforting feeling, because you realize that life is more about just having fun, and that there is a greater being out there who really cares for you and cares for what is happening in this earth and has a plan for it all. It's one of the most comforting feelings there is, and I can promise you, if you think a bit harder about these things, you won't be disappointed. And that's it for today's video. If you have any comments or anything you'd like to add, questions, just let me know in the comments and I'd be happy to respond. And if you like the video, feel free to subscribe if that's something you're into, and I will see you next time. Until then, may God bless. Bye.